Thank you, Sean. Thanks for the invitation and allowing us to speak. And Maria is just saying one convener because she's always afraid I'm going to ask her to do more. So I'm going to share my screen and let's get going here. So do you see the full screen?
Yes.
Yes, I think you do. Okay. So I'll just need to... Oh, something was in the way. So we talk today about 18969, a very hot topic. I mean, I've been in standardization since many, many, many years, but the 18969, I think, contributed to a few too many gray hairs. It was rocky road to get where we are now. So a bit about myself. I've been in the medical device industry over 30 years. It's actually close to 40 years. And I've been leading the technique TC194 working group 4 since 2008. Mainly initially for 14155, and then since 3-4 years, the 18969 baby was added to our list of things to do. So that's what we're going to talk today about. That was just a short intro. So you need to be aware that this standard is a draft international standard, which means we are waiting for the comments to come in March, and they will probably influence still a lot of its content. Sorry. But what is important to understand is what we're going to talk about today is the philosophy behind 18969, which in my view is pretty important to understand and to take home. So I always start with this a little bit. I'm a bad drawer on slides, so this is really homemade. The next one is much better. When do you actually start with clinical evaluation? And a lot of people think that clinical evaluation under the European regulatory process, at least, is this evil mandatory documents that you need to write right at the end when you don't have time anymore and you need to do them quickly. And that's not what our document is about. Our document is the 18969 is not about document writing, but really about a process. So that process really starts very early on in the design and development phase with the design planning. So we came up with this nice little, let me put, because I can't see it fully, with this nice drawing that was actually, I gave a very ugly drawing to a designer and he came up with something like this. So we think in our standard that there are a lot of people that should work together from the beginning, and that includes the clinical evaluation. There's a lot of input that clinical evaluation can get early on to be prepared for later activities. But there's also a lot of input clinical evaluation can give into design and development, into risk management, regulatory, and other functions. So you will see there's a lot of dotted lines with a lot of repeated activities. For us, it's a process. It's something that is over time evolves, matures, and becomes obviously more firmly determined. In the beginning, and that's what I'm going to repeat in this presentation a lot, in the beginning, it's a collaboration. It's a collaboration for risk management to have the full input from clinical about what is needed. Also, design and development can give already some early inputs about what is the intended use, what do we think the risks may be, what do we think clinical performance may be. But it's an ongoing process, and the process is even enlarged once we know enough about the device and the device is ready for human use to be used in clinical investigations. That's that blue part at the bottom. So this is a little bit what this process wants to demonstrate. It's this graph or this image wants to demonstrate is it's an integrated process that starts early on, and then you will not have those mandatory, evil, necessary documents at the end because you will be prepared throughout the process. So we, in the standard, to make it easy and to also look at it a little bit from a process and how the process evolves, we've kind of come up with these four development phases: early development, mid-development, late development, and then the post-market phase. And each of the phases, clinical evaluation can, we've worked out what clinical evaluation can contribute, what happens during this phase. So in the early development phase, we talk about defining the therapeutic needs and the clinical context. There are potential patient populations. We don't know yet. They may reduce, they may enlarge, they may, we need to see it in this early development. Possible indications for use, the intended clinical benefit, you develop the device for something, so you must have an idea what it will deliver as benefits to patients. What are these current medical and non-medical alternatives so that you justify why you designed this new device? Also, relevant evaluation criteria. So the purpose there is really establish a solid clinical rationale for developing the device at this early phase. And that's where the collaboration between design and development and clinical evaluation or the clinical team can be very optimal. The mid-development, we start knowing more and more about the device, whereby what do we know already? Do we know things from other products, from other what we call medical and non-medical alternatives? And start planning, how are we going to generate the evidence when the device is ready to be used on human beings? And then in the late development, meaning really we have kind of a frozen design of the device. We know a lot of the device. We really are going to, we are generating this clinical evidence on a specific patient population with specific claims that were developed, with specific indications, contraindications, and so on. So we really want to document that clinical evidence to ensure readiness for market release and plan then the post-market surveillance activities. And then the last phase is the post-market phase, where we continue to look to work with design development where needed, with risk management where needed, with the regulatory people and so on, and we do the clinical part of the activities. So these are more or less these four phases that we take as a baseline, a backbone of how the process evolves over the product life cycle. So I'm talking about this input, a little word here. The input from design and development, making the middle part a little bit bigger, is providing the clinical team with intended use, potential risks, clinical performance, clinical benefits, and user requirements. And then in a really integrated process, the early clinical evaluation planning starts. Whether you do that with I'm talking about a process, I'm not talking about a document, but you could already start populating your end documents, your clinical evaluation plan and clinical evaluation report, if you want to talk that way under MDR terminology, to start documenting these things. Obviously, you're going to have many versions, because by the time you get to the final version, there will be many iterations, because design and development has iterations. Risk management needs input from the clinical team on what type of risks are documented already with other medical and non-medical alternatives. So we really, in our standard, we emphasize on a strong cross-functional team collaboration, linking process of clinical evaluation with design development, clinical development, risk management, regulatory strategy, and later post-market surveillance. And now you may say, some people listening in, they may say, we do that already, which is good. But I think Maria can also confirm in her presentation that many don't. And that's where people work in silos, and that's where things get ambiguous, inconsistent in the documentation, And where at the end, there are the clinical evaluation people who only get like a couple of weeks to write a clinical evaluation report because they haven't started on anything earlier. They haven't worked, were not worked into the whole process. That's important. So this slide kind of depicts a little bit a longer list of inter-process input and the input back from the clinical evaluation. So it's an ongoing process. This is not like a one go. Not everything will be ready at once to give to clinical evaluation, and clinical evaluation may not find everything neither because they will do some searches in the literature or searches in available knowledge, any sources, and they may come up with some things that prompts new questions from design and development or risk management and so on and so on. It's important to look at that as an ongoing process of collaboration. So open the doors and the windows and stop working in silos. So during the planning, a little bit more of information here. ISO 18969 leaves open to manufacturers how to document things, but specifies what to document. So we're not going to make a mandatory template of a CEP, CR. Everybody has their template already, but we have a list of things in an annex that we say this needs to be documented in way or another. Now, we have a lot of pressures from people who are MDR brainwashed, let me say it that way. That's saying we should talk about a CEP and a CER. Well, my perspective is like that, and I have lived through that with some elements of 14155 as well. Even though regulations say a certain thing, when you start really looking at it from a process-oriented thing, and believe me, we have notified bodies on our working group that say, yeah, there's a point here. We may get better information, better documents, if we look at it as an integrated process. They are a bit like, yes, but MDR says planning a report. Well, fine, but our process doesn't interfere with these documents, really, because you can still document certain things in a plan and in a report. So during the early stages, several iterations of the searches in the literature, but also in other available sources may be performed. They may not require the rigor of the appraisal, like we say, you need to do it before you just finalize your document and make really a final clinical evidence. So sometimes there are questions that we try to answer by looking at available information that don't need all the rigor. So this is also, again, a little bit where we want to balance the things. And we don't want to overburden. One of our missions was try to keep it simple, but integrated. Facts such as confirming applicable GSPRs, final claims, quantifications of these claims may be completed over time while the product design is being set. So if you want to document all these activities and all these findings in a clinical evaluation plan, you be prepared just to have updates of it while the document becomes mature. Work with versions and include also early drawings that then correspond to your findings. So you know why you found this data in the literature that may not be any more applicable in a later design. So you may then run your search in a different way. The analysis of data from available medical and non-medical authors may not be subject to all requirements, neither that are part of a formal pre-CE mark planning document. And because in the planning, we are really working on the available information on the claims and so on, what we call SOTA now, and you may have realized that I haven't used the word SOTA yet because we're trying to minimize, we're trying to work really with available knowledge. But what we call now the SOTA analysis of available medical and non-medical alternatives may actually become more part of the plan than the report. I mean, I would say, who cares? Notified bodies will go like, hey, but we need an analysis. And so it can be done whenever it is ready. And if it's part of the planning, because you know, this chicken and the egg, where we need to quantify in the planning our claims, but we need to do the SOTA analysis in the report. That's also what we're trying to solve here a little bit. So guidance is provided on sources, considerations for medical and non-medical alternatives, and then we have some special considerations on transferability of clinical data. We are not using the term equivalence. This is a regulatory term for us. We're in the process. We just say there are regulations that may allow you to transfer data from one device to another, and then go to these regulations. And we give the links to the regulations, but we're not a regulatory document. And then we also have special considerations for certain types of devices. And that in the draft, in my personal humble opinion, we still need to work it out a little bit better. Where we just say, okay, SAMD, including AI, may need special considerations, but we don't say what they are. So I think in between the DIS and the FDIS, the final draft, those are areas that we need to work on a little bit better, and also on these other products. We also have some conditions allowing limited types of data when there is no interaction with patients and so on. It's quite briefly, but to really, I think it may come out with not that much precision, because we want a document to come out and then mature over time, and we'll get feedback. We've done like that with the 14155 as well. The most important thing is that we have that process-oriented document that comes out as quickly as possible. And then, as I said before, with a true integrated process where the analysis of available medical and non-medical alternatives has been conducted in an early design phase, like acceptance criteria are defined in the CEP, articles substantiating accepted criteria, and so on. It may well be that the whole SOTA analysis becomes part of your planning, because you need to go into that SOTA, into these available measures, to be able to substantiate already how you're going to position your device within all that. So let's see how we can make this as clear as possible. What we have done, you need to know, the way this document has been written was trying to put the MDR aside, but to think about the process, so that this process is not only useful for the MDR, but also useful to start a clinical investigation, which FDA is looking at quite a lot, and even Japan is looking at it quite a lot. It can be useful at so many opportunities. It can be useful input to risk management. So we get more meaningful information out of the risk management document as clinical people. That's also a mission that I still need to work on with the 14971. It's firm in our plans to start discussing, put our heads together with that group. So that integration is really important. And I promise not to talk too long, but to leave time for questions. So I think this is my last slide, and then I'm handing it over to Maria before we go into questions. Stop sharing. There we go.
So I've gone ahead and posted the poll question. It's just 3 questions, so please answer that so that we have some feedback. Maria, feel free to minimize it on your screen and talk over it.
Okay.
And it will run for a couple minutes. Reminder, if you want a certificate of attendance, please write your name and email address into the chat, and we will provide that. Please be patient with us. It takes us a couple days. We do these manually. But if you don't get it by, sometime next week, let me know. That's all I'm going to say. Maria, it's all you.
Oh, yes. It's a pleasure to actually have this opportunity and to actually share time with Danielle on this subject. I'm gonna, before I get into my presentation, I'm just gonna say something that uh, and I don't know if those of you who are evaluators who actually do clinical evaluation reports, I've not always been a fan of this process. And I won't get into more of that now, but when the effort of 18969 started, I wasn't a fan of that either. There was a lot of work put into how this could be useful. I mean, there were people who thought that the process of clinical evaluation could be useful in general, not just as it's done in Europe. And it evolved into the process of clinical evaluation. And that's when I thought, oh yeah, okay, fine. Until that happened, I was not happy. So now I see really very nice potential for the practical use of this. So with that, I want to get started. So I'm going to be talking about some of the ways this could actually work, how you would incorporate clinical evaluation or deal with it in terms of existing standards. So the 13485 quality management system, 14971, which Danielle mentioned, of course, risk management, and also regulatory strategy. Just about me, oh dear, 40 years, scary. U.S. and EU regulatory experience. I deal just with those two regions. I'm a stakeholder member in the EU MDCG group that develops clinical evaluation and clinical investigation guidance, and have the pleasure of being a member of ISO TC194 Working Group 4 for a very long time, working with Danielle and seeing how amazing she works with these herding cats and dealing with complicated issues. And then, of course, I've been an evaluator of clinical evaluation plans and reports for over 20 years, another yikes moment. So what I'd like to do is, Danielle mentioned the MDR and the need to kind of keep that in mind, but uh, we have in clinical evaluation very good working knowledge of what that means in Europe. So even though we're working on an international standard, and the idea is to go through valuable processes that could work for anyone anywhere, we do have a practice, a set of data and experiences based on Europe. And Europe, of course, as you know, most people know, uh, has very, very strict requirements for clinical evaluation. So yes, the MDR specifies very stringent requirements. What's really happening? And again, Danielle made a point about this. What's really happening is clinical evaluation is addressed very, very late in the design and development uh, process. And at that point, when it's being dealt with, it's very late in the process. So it's then the other issue is that, and these are just miscellaneous issues that arise. Clinical data to support marketing claims. You know, companies consider marketing claims, clinical marketing claims, sometimes very important. And very often they're treated as an afterthought. They're not even addressed early in the design and development, or if they're not addressed in a systematic way when you are developing your clinical study documentation. Now, we know that risk management teams perform a very rigorous and strenuous work and very detailed work. But as again was pointed out by Danielle, they don't always have the clinical input that is later going to avoid problems with regulatory scrutiny. And then the regulatory strategy, and I'm going to touch on this briefly, is not always consistent with or in line with how clinical data are generated with clinical evaluation requirements, and they're very separate activities and they're not coordinated. So the potential value of this standard is, again, it provides a process. And there, and if you are talking about and I'm not talking about a post-market, I'm talking about mostly pre-market or the first time that you are designing and developing a device. So in terms of design and development and risk management and regulatory strategy, the idea is to have a process that deals with this deals with these issues in an organized manner. So how can we do that? We have tools. So again, and I'm thinking about 10 different things while I'm speaking, so bear with me. But in terms of actually using the 18969 um, uh, standard, 969 standard, we have tools. We have the Quality Management System Standard, 13485 on the left, and we have a guide. And hopefully many of you have experienced or have used the guide, which can provide more detailed information than has been included in the standard. So I'm just going to go through certain parts of the design and development planning activities or design and development stages or phases and just make certain points about how these can be useful in terms of clinical evaluation. So those of you who are familiar with the design and development process know that the planning stage uh, is critical. You don't just launch into design and development. You really need to plan it carefully. You need to document it carefully. It's a very important part of the standard, and it's not always done in a way that should be done, but it's critical. So you define your stages, and then um, another important element is that you define the reviews that you are going to, and these are meetings, they could be in person, they could be remote, whatever, meetings of the design and development people who were involved in that process. And the idea of the review is to evaluate each stage of the design and development. Then, of course, you have verification, validation, and design transfer. You need to talk about what you're going to do. Again, this is planning all of these activities. The responsibilities and authorities are critical. Who's going to do what? And how, and also if you outputs to inputs traceability is how are you going to do that? Because you're going to have a lot of requirements. Those are the inputs, and they have to relate to the outputs, or they're going in different directions. And of course, the resources that are needed. Now, this is where it's interesting to think, let's involve clinical expertise or clinical evaluation expertise. And if it's the same person, fine. If they're different people, the ideal situation is that you have people involved at this stage early on with what you're going to have to deal with later on. And again, we're talking about the regulatory world where design and development is heavily regulated. The other place where you can identify clinical evaluation or where it is useful and productive to do that is when you are defining your resources, the necessary competence of personnel. So again, during the planning phase, if you're in an ideal world, this is when you're talking about that, and you are including these people at that point. Now, design and development inputs inputs another word for requirements. This is another critical stage in design and development. This is where to be effective, you are considering all of the various elements that are involved in the design and development process. So clearly, you're going to have to cover these areas. So functional, performance, usability, safety requirements, absolutely. This is the area that is addressed, but not always effectively. In your requirements of design and development, in your inputs, the regulatory requirements and standards, I get the feeling that companies don't always anticipate where they're going to market their device. It seems like something that ought to be automatic, but sometimes it's not. If you're initially going to be in Europe, fine. But if you're thinking about the US, it would be a good idea to at least have that in mind. Now, this is another element. Risk management, the results, the output of risk management is a design input. What you end up deciding which are the requirements, or you identify risk and how you reduce risks, um, and how you introduce risk control measures. All of that, the output of your risk management program becomes a requirement of design and development. It seems counterintuitive, but that's what happens. Risk management feeds into your design, and you need to pay attention to those elements that you have identified as risks, and make sure that your device design is designed with those in mind, or trying to reduce as much as possible. You might have information from previous designs, and of course there are other requirements. Now, this is a critical element for clinical evaluation. I've highlighted performance and safety requirements. Of course, many clinical evaluation reports include usability, but for the purposes of this discussion, I'm just highlighting those two, performance and safety. And again, the outputs of risk management. So we're talking about how the standard 18969 can be useful in the process, the process of arriving at the information that you need to develop. So, clinical evaluation expertise can really support just about all of these of inputs. And when I say clinical evaluation expertise, I'm not talking about clinical expertise. Clinical expertise is absolutely valuable. As I said before, if you have it in the same person or group of people, you have both clinical expertise and clinical evaluation expertise, all the better. So another critical a critical aspect of design and development is the design and review process. This is when you examine and you define what the stages are, but you examine the stages where you're going to get everybody together, and I mentioned this before, to look at whether or not the requirements or the activities of a particular stage have been followed and the requirements of that stage have been met. You are going to, and this is, as you can imagine, simplifying this greatly, identify any actions that need to be taken, and participants need to, and the standard specifies this, participants need to include representatives of various functions, but certainly the functions concerned with the design and development stage, the particular stage that's being discussed, and other specialist personnel. Now, a lot of you may know that FDA forever had required that someone independent of design be involved with design reviews. Since the adoption of 13485, that specific requirement is not in is no longer a part of the FDA requirements, but it makes sense in this discussion to consider that the other specialist personnel who may not be involved in the actual design would be clinical and or clinical, preferably and clinical support with clinical and clinical evaluation expertise. This is the stage where, I was going to say the rubber hits the road. I said it. This is where the validation activity is intended to demonstrate that the device meets its requirements. So this is specifically talking about design validation. Design validation can include a number of activities to show that the device is meeting its requirements. And it's tempting to get into a discussion of design verification, but what we're talking about here is the validation, clinical studies. If you are going to need to conduct clinical studies, it's a part of design validation. It's done when you've done all of the other work that's been necessary to do beforehand. And just pointing out something in the standard 13485 mentions clinical evaluations or performance evaluations in the case of IVDs. So it states that clinical evaluations or performance evaluations must comply with applicable regulatory requirements. That's a small statement. It's a big meaning. It's speaking, however, generically. It's not referring to what we are facing in Europe as clinical evaluation or performance evaluation. So the point that I wanted to make here is that the design validation process is where, or in terms of clinical studies, it's the stage where you are showing that the device meets meets the requirements that are consistent with its intended use. So just pretty briefly, the other critical part, and again, we're talking about how to make the activity of 18969 practical and useful. Now, again, we've got the tools already. We're anxious for the standard to be completed, but it's already there are things that we can do that are useful. So the risk management standard 14971, most of you are familiar with that. Hopefully most of you are also familiar with the guidance document 24971, which has significant information that can be useful that is not in the standard itself. So I'm just going to make, there's a particular point for the purposes of time that I want to make. It's a kind of a personal I'm not sure how to describe it. Uh, the it Danielle emphasized the fact that there is benefit to have people work together, to have clinical expertise, to have risk management expertise work together. I'm just going to give you one example of something that happens, and you may see it as well. Those of you who develop clinical evaluation plans and reports. A key element of the risk management process are these matrices, these tables, the risk analysis, whatever you call them. They list, they're like, you can't have a document that's more important than risk as far as I'm concerned. They're listing the hazards. And I'm listing these things on the left-hand side. The sequence of events that can lead to hazardous situations. If you do not have a hazardous situation, you don't have any harm. So all of this information is critical. Then you have the severity and probability of that harm before you have defined your risk control measure, something you're going to do to reduce, it's hard to eliminate a risk, but something that's going to reduce it to an acceptable level. And then you have the risk control measures themselves. And most companies, they document those. It's going to be an animal study. It's going to be a bench test. It's going to be information in the IFU. All kinds of things to try to reduce the risk, and those are documented in risk control, in the risk control, usually columns of these tables. And then you have severity, again, that doesn't usually change. It's always the same severity of a harm. And the probability after the risk control measures. I didn't list all of the elements of the table, but what you do also have, and what you've now introduced all these risk control measures, that's not enough. You have to verify that they have been effective. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to include something in an IFU, or I'm going to do a dog study, or I'm going to. You have to show that they've been effective. I cannot tell you how many risk tables I've seen where clinical studies have been conducted, and they are not indicated as a method to verify the effectiveness of a risk control method. This is a regulatory issue. If clinical studies have been conducted for a particular, and they have, to show that the device works and is safe, From a risk point of view, you really need to indicate where that clinical data applies to a particular risk. And then the last point, ensuring that all risks have been adequately addressed is a critical component of the clinical evaluation process. Very small statement, very important, very critical. It's one of the areas that one would spend, one of the most time is spent in clinical evaluation looking at safety and the information that is backing up that safety. Um, In terms of regulatory strategy, and I've put in EU and FDA because again, this whole discussion is about a standard, an international standard. But, and by the way, I might have said it clearly at the beginning, I'm not sure, that the standard makes the point that you really do need to consider regulatory strategy. So the importance of 1345 in terms of um, uh, design controls and in terms of risk, fine. But regulatory strategy is key, clearly, because again, when you are launching a new product and you go to all the trouble to do that, and then you find out that you've not met the regulations is tragic. So the regulatory strategy needs to be aligned with the clinical data requirements. A tiny little statement, very simple statement, but it very often is not done. We know instinctively we have to conduct a clinical study. What are the regulatory implications? That's not always examined properly. And again, the standard is to help us to be much more formal in all of that, in that activity. Clinical investigations are definitely not always planned considering the regulatory expectations for all kinds of reasons. Uh, that would be very interesting to get into, like investors and pressure and timelines. This is the third point, though, is something that is very interesting. The MedDev guidance document for clinical evaluation that was developed for under the directives and is still used for the MDR as long as you make sure that you're complying with the MDR and not the directives, still includes very interesting and useful information. And one of them is your clinical data, if it's going to be important and not just, additional information, but if it really is important and you are basing your CE marking or your even U.S. Clearance or entering the market there, methodological quality and scientific validity are elements, and they're long lists. Not, I shouldn't say long. They're fine. The lists that are of activities and considerations that go into the deciding the methodological quality, um, and whether your data are valid determine whether the data are going to be acceptable from a regulatory point of view, and very often is not looked at um, as an activity. And and where I see this and where I have to look at this, it's when somebody says, here is all the device information. Please develop the clinical evaluation plan, which is funny, and report. Um, and then that's when the methodological quality and scientific validity is looked at. At that stage, it's something that Danielle mentioned before. It's too late. So 18969 supports the alignment of generating clinical data with sensible regulatory strategy. Again, not specific, rigid. Let me cross the rigid part out, even though I mean it. But with the regulatory strategy, we have to meet the regulations. So I'm just going to end this. I almost want to call it a tirade, but I hope it's not taken that way. What can we do now? We're waiting for the 18969 to be to be in final form, hopefully to evolve to the point where it's a published standard. But in the meantime, there's certain things we can do. We can involve clinical and clinical evaluation expertise in the design and development process now. That's what I mentioned earlier. That's what Danielle mentioned. Um, I didn't spend a lot of time on methodological quality and scientific validity, but you can do that now, and the sooner you do it, the better. And it would be lovely to do it as you are developing your clinical study a protocol early in the process. Not you've done the data and now you have to retrofit what you've done into having some type of validity. Um, Clearly, it would be very helpful if the risk management documentation identified where clinical data were actually used to verify risk control measures. And um, the final activity would be to don't forget about marketing claims. Think about them early on and try to include them and so that they are substantiated by data and not left out so that you have to actually eliminate a marketing claim. So with that, I'm going to that's it for me, and hopefully we have time for questions.
I
We
think we have, and we do have questions. So I'm going to start with the easy ones. Sorry, I'm not following the exact order, but when can we expect the standard to be approved? The standard, we have to finish. Well, I have the mission of finishing all the comments that we will receive in March to integrate them and to come out with a final draft international standard by the 17th of August. It's a very specific date that is according to the ISO rules and so on. Once, for those of you who are not familiar, once an FDIS is published, very little can still be changed afterwards. So hopefully, if we are done with the FDIS and we send it to ISO, they take usually another 6 to 8 weeks to edit it and do some things about it. So I guess sometime around October, FDIS. And meaning then, yes, people can make editorial comments, but no longer technical comments. But it's an ongoing work. So even if we bring out a document in October, we'll probably have to kick in and continue to work on it, but we'll just bring out the document that is already useful. So
Danielle, yeah, when you finish, let me know.
Yeah, I'm finished. We have other
Yeah,
questions.
there's one that I'd like to do take, and that is how likely is it that the United States will
Oh,
adopt
no.
this ISO? You might have seen this. It'll be a tremendous burden to manufacturers to have to create CERs for US only devices. So let me just briefly say something, and then Danielle, please. So first of all, at this point, FDA does not require the clinical evaluation process or documentation that's required in Europe. And so a lot of what I felt initially about clinical evaluation was really colored by that. You know, FDA doesn't need it. The requirements, FDA and U.S. requirements are they're very often known, and the system is so different than in Europe. And then you have FDA, the personnel who've developed a lot of expertise. You can go to pre-sub and you can do all of that. I now believe that because companies do not always go to the U.S. prepared, they don't always go systematically understanding what a good clinical design means and how risks are reduced, that there is a potential to use the approach that is being described and developed in 18969 even for the U.S. There are fair number of companies that get turned back from the U.S. and from the proposals of their clinical study designs. So there is value, but in terms of FDA actually adopting the ISO or the Danielle, you may want to speak to that.
Well, this is where ISO 18969 is not a regulatory document. It's a guidance that describes a
Perfect.
process. And that doesn't mean that all of a sudden, because 18969, even if FDA approves it, because they have given already quite a lot of input. Lately, we've lost our FDA member, but I'm not going to get into that battle. But even if FDA approves the document, that doesn't mean that their regulations are going to change. We are not looking to change regulation. We're just saying at a process, make it useful, make it a useful collaboration between risk management and 13485. That doesn't mean make it mandatory or, hey, FDA, change your regulations. No, this process is useful for many other things, not only for MDR. So that's what I would say. No, I don't think so.
Yeah, agreed.
And then there is the question, is C often late because engineers R&D are trying to develop a product first and then they have something workable? Only then do they spend the expense of clinical evaluation? Well, I think the comment again looks at it from a point of view of we need those documents. But the clinical evaluation, as I tried to explain in my presentation, is not the whole process all the time. It is a collaborative effort that if R&D and risk management is helped by clinical, the process can be more useful and more effective and productive. So I don't see it, if at all, 18969 is trying to make it more efficient rather than. But if you look at it, of course, from an MBR perspective, saying, well, we need those two documents at the end, then yeah, R&D will always wait until they have a full developed product or will be tempted to wait. But large companies that have a full, a good process in place, integrated process in place, they apply already what 18969 is trying to achieve. I don't know, you want to add
Okay.
something, Maria? What is the audit cycle for a CEO class
I was
3?
just looking through the questions. There was one. Yeah. I feel like this draft ISO is geared towards higher risk devices, those that require clinical investigation. Device line extensions for lower class devices need a much more simple, less involved process. Fine, but too often, even for lower class devices, even for those devices, the level of risk, the level of data that you need, even if it's all about understanding the level of data that you need, information and data to feel secure about safety and performance or um, effectiveness, which is a term used in the U.S. And if the standard can be developed to the degree that I hope it can be, it's just a way of not waiting until the end to look at safety and performance elements ad hoc or not at all or not enough and to get people involved. Having clinical expertise can indicate that you don't have a risk where you thought you had one. It can give you a much more accurate set of or it can give you much more accurate information than if you don't have that expertise, or if someone is basing a decision on what they think or maybe on an article that it may or may not be interpreted correctly. So it if the process works properly, and if the standard can end up to be where I hope it can be, it's giving companies, I want to be careful about how I'm describing this. It's a system it's a way to function in an organized manner with the people who should be involved so that you avoid wasting time, wasting money. Everybody's concerned about efficiency and getting things done in an efficient manner. And what I see most often is when decisions have been made, this thing is plopped in your lap, and the people who could be useful in avoiding problems with safety and performance have not been involved in the process. It's a very, very common situation.
We have another one. If you already comply with the MDR requirements, does ISO 18969 add any requirements? No. We are just laying out the process. MDR is not laying out the process. MDR is asking for information, but they don't necessarily lay out the process. So it is not our intention to add requirements. It's just our intention to clarify the process for those companies where it's not in place. I think that's, and then by incorporating the new search in early planning phase, do you mean that literature search protocols to be outlined? This is exactly what I was trying to say. These early searches don't necessarily need the rigor that you would apply when you do your searches really for the end evidence that you want to give. But I strongly suggest that it's a little bit how complicated you want to make it. But I strongly suggest that you work in a systematic manner, that if you do a search, that you at least document a little bit what the subject of your search was, what were your keywords, because if you don't come up with the right output, you at least know, you can go back and see what did I do wrong. So it's more a practical thing than anything mandatory that we're trying to make. But the early ones indeed are less strict and less formal, but it's always good to document what you've done and what the basis of your searches were. So anything else that I can find? Maybe time for one more question. The concept of CR is already part of Japan and China. Yeah. Well, I see the question here. The concept is already part of the Japan and not, I think not that much of Japan, but definitely China, because we have a hard time getting our Japanese friends on board with our standard. They are actually afraid that Japan is now going to try and implement, like the question here about US FDA. We're not in, we really don't want to interfere with the regulations. Again, I repeat it again over and over, we really want to map out the process so that people can work better together and we can come in better documentation of clinical evidence.
Thank you. We're about out of time, and so I want to thank all of the attendees. I want to thank the speakers. I want to remind everybody of the upcoming events. Again, if you want a certificate, please put your name and email address in the chat. Please answer the survey that's going to pop up on your screen when you close this. Maria, Danielle, any closing words as we sign off? Thank you both very much.
Well, there's still a lot to come, so we need to work further on the documents. I hope we can make it as useful as possible. And please give it a chance. It's going to be work in progress, process as we get input and people learn to work with it.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. It's just supposed to make sense. It's supposed to help. It's not supposed to add a layer of unnecessary work. There is some discipline to it, but if it's done correctly, then there's going to be the payoff of knowing what you're doing instead of just winging it. So,
Yeah, and if there are questions that were not answered, feel free to send me an email. Okay, well, thank you all.
Thank you everyone for your time and attention. As I mentioned earlier, the recording and slides will be sent tomorrow, approximately 24 hours after the event, via the same Zoom email that you registered with. So thank you again. I hope everybody has a wonderful day or evening, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Shell.